Angie. Well, welcome everybody. I'm sure there'll be other people piling in momentarily, but we're going to get started since it's 10:30 and we like to get started on time. We have with us today an esteemed guest, somebody who's going to give us some interesting insight into the world of newspapers, etc. Jon Hunter. And Jon Hunter has newspaper in his blood, so to speak, because he comes from a kind of newspaper family, and we'll learn more about that. But he's been the publisher of the Madison Daily Leader, and we're going to learn a lot about the newspaper business, where it has been and where it is now and where it possibly could go. And so I'm hoping all of you will have questions and insights and comments as we go into the program. Keep in mind that this is an interactive program. The whole point is to have people to have exchanges with not only our guests, but also with each of you, between all of you. So that's kind of like the whole point of this program, is to have a dialogue. So with that, Jon, welcome to the program.
Lawrence, thank you. It's an honor to be here.
We're going to get started by asking you to give us a little background on who is Jon Hunter really?
You'll have to ask my wife. She knows all the behind the scenes kind of thing. But I was born in Madison, South Dakota, and grew up here. Then went away, went to Arizona State for my education, and then lived in California for a while. But the call of South Dakota came strong, and so my wife and I decided to bring our newborn daughter and move back to Madison. And so we just love South Dakota. Our parents were all alive at that point, and we were just thrilled to live here. I started working at the newspaper with my father, maybe a 5-year transition, maybe from his role as publisher. His father was publisher before that. So I was the third generation. My father unexpectedly died within a few weeks of when we returned. And so there we were. And so I remained publisher for 31 years. It was just a delightful career. Newspapering is for people who are curious, and I've always considered myself a curious person, a reader and listener. It's a great career to be involved with. And so the Madison Daily Leader is still strong today, and it is now published by so I sold it a year ago, and or in 2021. Depends upon when you listen to this event, but but it's now managed by another third generation newspaper family that I'm proud to know, and I respect their work. So Madison, I think, has been blessed with a great newspaper for a long time, and it's been around 140 some years. A fascinating history of its own, which maybe is not for today, but if you ever want to hear some of these great stories, there's plenty of them.
Yeah, sounds like you guys got started right after Gutenberg invented the press.
Well, I will break in, Lawrence, and tell you a quick one. So newspapering was the only game in town when the trains first started to cross South Dakota. And so the Madison Daily started as a weekly newspaper in the town of Herman, which no longer exists. There was another weekly in the town of Madison. When the railroad came through, it said, we're not stopping twice, we're going to stop in the middle. And so those towns merged together, and the two newspapers battled it out. They eventually both became daily newspapers. And for a time, there was a third daily newspaper in Madison. So Madison had 3 daily newspapers, all battling it out for the latest news and information and advertising. And Eventually, of course, it just became one. But imagine those days in the 1920s when you had 3 daily newspapers all pounding the streets. It was must have been quite a time.
It must have been, and a well-informed public, that always helped.
Yes, yes,
So
and newspapers were not inexpensive. They were they were more expensive than they are today in relative terms to inflation. So people were hungry for news and to help improve their lives. And so yeah, it was a great prairie story.
yeah, I think that will really figure into our conversation today as we kind of link the past, present, and future. But before we actually get into that, you're going to be having, I don't know if you call it a speaker, but you're going to be interviewing someone on forming a more perfect union. Can you talk a little bit about that before we get into our main subject?
Sure, that is an event on Monday. The South Dakota Humanities Council is sponsoring that and bringing an author, Anand Girdhardhas, if I pronounce that correctly. He is a former columnist for the New York Times and other such credentials, and he has written a recent book about the persuaders, or the influence of people in media and social media and others, and how that affects democracy. And it's going to be a great evening of conversation, so I'm looking forward to that. But you're right, Lawrence, that does tie in directly to traditional media, social media, and all sorts of communication among us all.
Yes, and where is that going to be?
That is at the Washington Pavilion. Jennifer, if you want to explain a little bit more about, I believe it's a free event, and it also starts at 7 p.m., has a reception beforehand. I don't know if that's public, or maybe Jennifer, you want to take over.
Oh, yeah, you're correct. We'll be in the Belvis Theater at 7 p.m. Expecting about an hour-long conversation. There'll be a chance for audience Q&A. So if people have questions, they can pass them on to the author. And at 8 o'clock, we'll have a book signing. Anand will be signing his books, and Zandros will be there selling them. I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. Anand's work covers a lot of ground. He has a lot of interest in financial sector. As Jon said, he's a journalist. This is his 4th book, The Persuaders. And I just think it's really timely in terms of what kind of what we're trying to do here too. The idea of how do you speak to someone with the hopes of persuading them, or at least getting them to hear what you're saying. And he goes through a bunch of different examples of people who do it in different ways, and even as a chapter that talks about misinformation and how we can combat that. And not everybody does it the same, but one of the quotes he used that really spoke to me was this idea that if we give up on having conversations with people, we have basically given up on democracy. And so I think he's going to have a lot of insight to share. So
okay. Well, we'll be looking forward to that. Those of you who can make that, you might want to tune in or get over to the Washington Pavilion. If I can make it, I'm certainly going to try to get over there myself. Jon, let's go back to our newspaper subject now. And can you make some comparison between the importance of newspapers back in the day, when, let's say, when it first got started, when you got started with it, and now? Can you talk about the importance of that to our daily lives? Or what part does or did newspapers play?
Well, newspapers, and I think other media as it has evolved over time, really were all about community, and that was learning what your neighbors were doing and telling your neighbors what you were doing, or what events there were going to be in town. There were going to be a gathering or a church service or whatever was going on. Some of the earliest newspapers in South Dakota, and one of the first recognized them was one called the Sioux Falls Pantagraph. And also the Yankton Press and Dakotian, pronounced that way. really were during the kind of the land rush and the homesteading, and they were really trying to build communities from scratch. They were a lot of real estate deals, a lot of, cattle deals and grain and so forth. So really they were at the very beginning of building communities in South Dakota, and virtually every nook and cranny had a newspaper, and it was important for them, as important as eventually a post office or a railroad depot or a school or any of those. That a newspaper was clearly part of what you wanted to build in your community. And there's a great book. Some of you I know remember Bob Karlevitz wrote a great book on newspapering in South Dakota, and he listed all these newspapers, and you'd have a town of 50 people have 2 weekly newspapers. It was they were absolutely critical in the forming of South Dakota, and frankly they're critical today. And there's a little bit of a dichotomy, which we might get into later, between kind of bigger cities and smaller South Dakota towns, but every single South Dakota town needed its paper to build community.
Right. It would seem like that's also the case today, but I wonder how much going to coffee has played into become the newspaper of the day in small towns.
Yes, and certainly verbal communication and other kinds of communication have either enhanced that and expanded that. Most of us in the media business believe more is better, and the more opportunities we have to talk with each other and communicate, the better. Maybe until there's a tipping point, and when it starts to become inaccurate or unfair or mean-spirited. And sometimes we have seen that sometimes in verbal kinds of things, where you get the coffee shop that you referred to, Lawrence, might just be a complaining post, or you might see social media, which then can have anonymous digs at other people that become unfair. So at some point, there is a line drawn that says this is contributing to our community, and another place where it starts to detract. And that line might be different for everybody. But I think there's probably some lines that we can all agree on that are harmful to each other. If I may just tell a quick story.
Sure.
This is a modern day story. So we had the unfortunate, terrible, awful incident of a murder in Madison, the first one in probably 100 years. And it was not very long ago, let's say 10 years ago. And it was on I believe a Tuesday night, or it was a weekday night. And the community really did not know what had happened. And rumors quickly spread. And it happened at night. We're an afternoon paper, so by the next afternoon we had published all sorts of stuff, and we went through extraordinary rigor to make sure that everything we printed was right. There's this concept that you can publish something, and if it's wrong you can fix it later. Well, if you're in print, you really can't erase yesterday's edition. So we went through, and when I say extraordinary rigor, we called in every possible journalist that we had to work on this story and made sure that every fact was double checked. Now, at the very same time, on a parallel path, Facebook and Twitter and so forth were running an opposite thing, and it was simply awful. On Facebook, they had, I think, gone so far as convicted in the public realm a person, a developmentally disabled person who some people thought had killed Mr. Johnson. It was an awful, awful scenario. And so, the next day, of course, we went through that same rigor and published day 2 of the thing, what we knew, and there was a lot more information about the thing, and then a day 3, and all of those I'm extraordinarily proud. I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but the contrast between the rumor and the unrigorous, is that a word? I'd run it through my editor to make sure that's a word. but the contrast was sharp, and I'm proud of the work we did, and I'm sad I felt sorry for the people who were convicted in the public eye by these rumors.
Right. I think that is the separating point, or should be the separating point, between a newspaper or any professional journalism and hearsay, and a lot of people, they seem to prefer hearsay. It's like, if you have the choice between a story that's factually accurate and one that's exciting, there's a lot of people who would take exciting over that every time. That said, how does a newspaper approach that dilemma?
Well, you have to, I think, Lawrence, the first thing you do is consider the audience, and you want to, if it's going to be a newspaper, a general interest newspaper like Madison or most of the others, then you have to think of the whole community and who that audience is. If you're a specialty newspaper, let's say you're the pork producers newspaper, you're speaking to a different audience. It's just the pork producers for something. But if you're a general interest newspaper, you've got the whole community to think of when you're putting that together. So you certainly want to, well, I think the main goal is you really want to reflect back to the community what it is. The pretty parts, the warts, whatever those kinds of things are. Some people ask, do you focus on good news or bad news? What sells newspapers? And we don't differentiate there. We just say whatever happens in Madison is what we're going to report. And if you can be as complete as you can, it tends to serve other people. There's some people who really want to know what the quilting club is doing this week. And a lot of people who aren't interested in that. Other people might just want to know what high school sports are doing. So that's why you have lots of pages and lots of small things about everything. And I think good general interest newspapers really try to reflect back to the community what they are and whatever that is. And I think the audience appreciates that. They can there are a lot of people who will skip the quilting club notes and go straight to the high school sports and vice versa. So give something to everyone and let them choose what they want to. Now, if I'm getting carried away here, most surveys about newspapers say that the audience or readers want four things. News, information, which is different from news. And, you could probably guess what the difference is. Information is, there's going to be the lighting of the Christmas tree on Friday, or, those sorts of things. They want opinion, which is interesting. And we'll talk about that in a second. And they want advertising. They want to know what sales are on at the local store and if gasoline or whatever, cars or whatever. But that opinion part strikes some people in today's newspapering and in social media and so forth. The big caveat to those four things is readers want to know which one is which before they start. And that, I think, is what has been breached a lot in all sorts of media today, television, newspapers, social media, and so forth. We start to read something, and you know what? We don't know in advance if it's going to be an opinion, or it's going to be fact-based, or if it's going to present both sides, or all three sides, or all 10 sides. And
I wonder.
Go ahead.
I'm just thinking. I wonder if changing the fonts for each one of those would help, at least between news and opinion.
Absolutely. I think you can do several things. That would be a good one. We actually label above, it says opinion above, and I sign that at the bottom. Bylines for stories says at the top. So we try to differentiate in every way you can. A lot of newspapers, again, traditional newspapers, let's call them, would have opinion pages where the whole page is going to be opinion. And that's so you can say, okay, I guess I'm in this page now. It tries to be clear. That's not always. I remember Tom Daschle once told me, he said he was a little frustrated at the New York Times because they would put something called news analysis on the front page. And so that is kind of, so what is it? Is it news or analysis? Which one is it? And it was clearly someone's perspective of what had happened. But it started to blur that line a little bit. Now, I'm not going to criticize the New York Times because it's a great newspaper, but I understand what Senator Daschle was talking about.
Yes.
Can I
Would you-
pop in?
Yeah, sure.
Lawrence?
Sure.
I just think there's a question in the chat that would be really, I think, useful to address here, and it's
Sure. I
from
didn't see
Richard.
it.
Yes,
Yeah.
Richard Hammond asked, and I think this is related back to the story of your work on the coverage of the murder in Madison. And he says, did you address the misinformation posted online in the newspaper sometime after becoming aware of it? In other words, was the misinformation news? And so, yeah, how do you address that as you're doing your due diligence and these stories are out there? Do you amplify them if you address them, or do you risk not correcting them, or is that your business? What do you think?
Well, I'm very impressed with the question, Richard. That is something that I think could be handled gracefully either way. If you just stuck to the facts themselves and presented that, I think that would be a good way of doing it. I think you could also address that and said, this particular thing has been said. Our research says that's not true, or the police chief said, or the sheriff, or whoever did. Does it amplify that in Jennifer's question? It could. Sometimes, and we worry too about talking or writing about, and we have an online presence too. I mean, we're part of that as well. But in either forum, you have to be careful about introducing something that is not yet fully fleshed out, because some people start to take that as fact right away. Especially I think the old adage, where there's smoke, there's fire. So if you say, okay, there's, we don't know, something's going on over here. In some people, they'll already take that all the way and say it's happened. And
Right.
so, it's delicate. But I think it can be respectfully done to address misinformation. But again, you can't just say, I think this is wrong. You have to back that up with something. In crime, such as the murder of Norm Johnson some years ago, you really needed to rely on people who had a vested interest in telling the truth. And that's going to be, law enforcement officers and family and people who are close to that thing, and not people who were hearing things second and third hand. It was quite a process to be rigorous in that. And we were very fortunate that we sometimes would get confirmation of facts just before deadline. So we'd heard it 12 hours before, could not go with it until we got that confirmation of it. And we were lucky in a couple of cases like that. But as far as Richard's question, was the misinformation news? I think it probably was. We did not specifically say, no, this particular person did not commit the murder. We didn't specifically say that. And it was really borne out later, of course, when they convicted in real life the man who did do it.
Well, I think that there's another twist to this question, and that is, if you deny something, it almost like makes people believe that it's true. It's that phenomena and the more facts that you present to show that the thing that they believe isn't true, the more they believe it. So how does a newspaper that's trying to deal in truth, how do you deal with that?
I know. We try, I think, in every case to give everybody involved an opportunity to say what they want. And so, which is sometimes interesting, if you're going to report that a city commissioner has done something incorrectly or against the law, it can be an uncomfortable phone call to say, Fred, we're going to report tomorrow that you did this. Is there anything you want to say about that? And you try to, if best you can, give them an opportunity to be thoughtful about that, and they can say whatever they pleased to. But yeah, I think, again, back to the original premise of reflecting back to the community. It's not our job to filter that. It's our job to try to present as much as we can within the framework of a family newspaper. We don't run the profanities if they say that. We don't even do the S blank star star star, you know, stuff. We just skip that sentence, I think.
Well, I think this is a good time to open it up to our esteemed panel here. Do you all have any questions or comments on newspapers? Not all about what I'm asking, but you guys have questions too, I believe. Anybody?
Okay, Rob, you have to be quiet for a couple minutes.
And then, so now you turn on.
Lo, these many minutes, John. I have reached my limit now.
Okay, he's got dirt on me.
I did not know about this murder in Madison and the whole story. And one part that stuck out to me was, we talk about social media websites. I'm a history professor, so I have to think a lot about, am I giving opinion here? Am I giving judgment? Am I giving facts? And it's tricky. I tell my students, beware of new words like social media, for example. And I have told them before, look, what this is an old thing. This is gossip. If we would just call these websites gossip websites, because I think there is a lot of value, as you say, in truth in labeling. This is opinion, this is advertising, and this is news. And by the way, this stuff over here, which I assume the Madison Daily Leader does not do, this is gossip, this is rumor, and that's all it is. But I think we sort of sanctify it as this social media thing, as if it was ever supposed to be more than gossip. There's been just an explosion in the sort of gossip economy in the last, I don't know, couple, 3 decades. It's all over cable news. It's all over websites. But that's all it is.
I agree. And, talking about whoever the marketers who came up with social media in the beginning were thinking ahead, and it gave it maybe credibility that it's different than what it turned out. So I'm with Rob on that.
Yeah. Well, there's another part to it too, is like, how do you, if you use something like, let's say, gossip, as opposed to social media, then it's still, people tend to want to believe that kind of thing. It's kind of like, people have this reverence for common sense when that's usually untested, it's untested ideas. That's usually what it boils down to. So people feel more comfortable with things they don't have to do research for. And so if something sounds exciting, they tend to want to, go with that, So even if you call it gossip media, you still have the same problem, is that people like my classic example is, for me anyway, is if Boy Scout helps a little old lady across the street every day, nobody wants to read that. But if you say the Boy Scout raped the little old lady, then everybody wants to read that story. So it's that, I think part of it is the whatever kind of media it is, but I think a lot of it comes back to us as human beings and as the public consuming that, is we prod that along by what we choose to read.
Jennifer, you had a chat here. Would you like me to address that?
Yeah, I think that would be great. I think that's a really good question, and something that some of the journalists in my life feel very strongly about as well. So
Yes, they do. Very respected journalists, by the way. The question is, why is it that when a paper has published the facts as they knew them, and it's later shown to be inaccurate or misinformation, the retraction or correction is generally a tiny note on a minor page that's barely noticeable? It's a great question. And there is no standard yet for how those are placed. We have, every newspaper has made mistakes, and how do you handle them? It needs to be a policy decision from the publisher to the editor, and again, respecting the readers in place. We had a policy, and I think it's still in place, of running all corrections in the same place. So always in this particular place, you can go, and the Wall Street Journal does the same thing. You open up to page 2 and there it is, corrections and amplifications, or whatever it says. And so people always knew that that was the place to go. It wasn't randomly tuck it in the classified somewhere. It was always on page 2. For us, it was always on page 3, upper right, period. And that was a place where people could go. Now, there is an argument, I think, that say, look, if you did a 6-column headline here that was wrong, why don't you do the 6-column headline that corrects it? And that can be done. Some people might choose to do that. I can only think of one situation really where we addressed it in a story, and it really was an embarrassing thing. It was for us. Some guy told us, and he was a longtime member of the community, told us about this organization that had been formed and the meeting that was held last Thursday at 7 o'clock at the bank and all this kind of stuff. And unfortunately, we believed him, and it turned out to be fictitious. And so we did, in fact, put in the same place on the front page that this thing did not happen and it was fictitious by this man. So anyway, I'm kind of dancing around a little bit. It's up to every different publication. You notice with internet things, you may see at the beginning of a story, this story has been modified since its original thing. Others may put that at the bottom. Others may not do it at all. So it probably is a matter of style. Consistency tends to work pretty well with most media if you do it, same way or the same place each time. But it's probably good to be honest about it and admit the errors in a notable enough way.
I remember there was one newspaper, unfortunately, I can't remember which one it was, in San Francisco, that their policy was wherever that, or approximately wherever that story appeared, they would put the correction in that spot. So it's sort of like if there was a headline story, then they would tell that story or say, reference the story and say, and have a pullout or something that says this thing was corrected, or it was said earlier that, and make some effort to point out that, okay, this part of the story has changed.
Another element of that is speed. You probably want to admit that as fast as you can in the next possible edition, which in South Dakota, there are newspapers that are published weekly. And so sometimes it may be a whole week before that correction comes through. And I think some have tried at least maybe put on their websites, by the way, this was, and so people might find out that there was an error rather than waiting for a full week.
Yeah. Well, that brings up another comparison between electronic media and print media. And that is one, they can make that correction much faster. But it also, there's a weak point in that too, when we're trying to do have historical accounts. You can have that story, but it depends on when people consume that story. And okay, yes, you can make the correction, but it just seems like sometimes people don't realize that something was said earlier and that it is a correction. And sometimes that becomes a problem. If you take, for example, someone says something on Facebook, just as an example, and then later someone calls them on it and they go back and change what they said. So it looks like the person's responding to nothing, or making a reasonable complaint, but they've changed the thing. That's harder to do in print. In fact, that's one of the values of print, is you can say, look, this is what it was on that day. Better in video form, but print is good too.
If I may, I'd like to propose a dilemma to our audience.
Oh, yeah.
See how this is. This is a true story, and I can tell you how we handle it, but I want to present that first. Typically, and again, in a small town newspaper, we would do stories like this all the time. And a new pastor came to town, and so we go over and interview the pastor. What's your background? Who are you? What do you want to do at and there's a photograph and so on. And at that time, we put that online on a free website. So then a number of years go by. That pastor was actually terminated by the church he was serving there, and he went on. And so for whatever reason, I don't even know the reason, but he left, let's say 2 years later or something like that. Goes on, a number of years. So about 10 years after that, he calls me and said, is there any way you can remove that story, which was a positive story about him, from your website? Because I have been, omitting those 2 years from my resume. And so when people discover, if they go to the internet and type in my name, they'll say, oh yeah, you served in Madison. What about that? And then they, of course, ask the uncomfortable question, why did you get fired? And so may I, Jennifer, Lawrence, present that to our audience and ask them how they would do that?
By the way, did he work in Madison in 1984? Is that what you asked him? Because this was Winston's job, right? He's asking you to be Winston. Hey, just change it. Put the old one down the burner, down the incinerator, and just write a new one. I'm sorry, John. This is not your best dilemma ever.
Yeah. I'll tell you other stories when we get done with this one too. But Rob, again, knows we're longtime friends, and just one of my closest friends, and he knows all the dirt. So whatever you need to know is you can get from Rob.
So my answer is no, don't do that.
Yeah. Anyone want to respond to that dilemma some time ago?
I think you can't unfire the gun.
And of course, Richard predicted what we did. We politely said, no, we don't pretend it never happened. So no, I very politely said, and he understood. He was gracious about it, and that was that. So you can look it up today if you want to.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd toss in another story before you get to your next question, Lawrence, and
Sure.
Only because Rob knows all these things. So believe it or not, the cover of the Madison Daily Leader was once on the Tonight Show with Jay Leno. Remember, he used to have headlines or whatever that feature was, and it had to do with juxtaposition, a story and a photograph near one another that maybe looked like they went together. Of course, then they are quite opposite. So on the front page of the Madison Daily Leader, we did a little story about a high school class who went out to Lake Herman and built some rafts out of driftwood. So their teacher took them out there. They found pieces of wood along the shore and strapped it together with duct tape or whatever. And so we had this photograph of these teenage boys on these homemade rafts made out of driftwood and duct tape. Well, nearby, probably too close, was a national headline that said, Reagan sends flotilla to the Gulf. I'm not sure we were going to win that battle, but anyway,
Well,
newspapering does give you a lot of stories. I will say that.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the interesting things about working in the news media and the papers in general is, there are those great stories that others might forget, but you remember. Betty, you were going to ask us a question?
Did it sell papers?
Sell papers.
I sure hope so. I didn't keep track, Betty, but if we made the Tonight Show with Leno, I guess that's good news.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Tell us about the archives. Alphonse wants to know if there are archives of small town newspapers.
Great news on that front. Yes, every newspaper in South Dakota that has existed up to a certain point is microfilmed at the State Library in Pierre. So literally every edition of the Madison Daily Leader or the Madison Sentinel or the Madison Outlook or the Ramona Times or the Wentworth Progress, they have all been placed on microfilm, and there's usually copies in a local library as well as at the state library in Pierre. Now, the bad news is that about 2 years ago, the state library said, we can't get microfilm anymore. Everything, of course, is in this different form. And so there was only one microfilm maker for a while and prices were going up. And so they chose to cease that project. So, but I do believe there is a substitute at some point where maybe PDF copies of newspapers are being stored. I actually don't know the state of the art on that. The State Newspaper Association has been very active working with the state library to make sure that that part of South Dakota history is captured. But the great news is, yeah, you could look up virtually anything on microfilm. It's a little harder, right? Because it's not as searchable. There was a project sometime, and I don't know the exact rules, but the copyright on newspapers runs out at some point. I always thought we owned our rights forever. It turns out I think it's something like 90 years, 90, which is half my age. So there are some, I know they have now digitized some copies of the Daily Leader using those microfilm things and are making those available free to the public. I think up until 1920s or something, from 1880s to 1920s. So there's a lot of great news about archives. I bet you could find any newspaper that's ever existed in South Dakota and find microfilmed copies of it at the state library.
I believe one time I went to the women's prison, and there was a group of ladies in there who were, I think they were taking the microfiche and digitizing.
Okay.
So I think, because I think there was some issue. I know that they were doing something with the archiving, but I think they were trying to make it searchable by.
I think that's true.
They were running it through the, like the readers, like, but they would scan it, and then they were going in making corrections so that it would be searchable. I think that.
Yeah, I think that's true. For the longest time, the Springfield prison was the ones who originally microfilmed them, and I do believe that the women's prison is working on that digitization project, but I think that's kind of incomplete. There's
Yes.
so many to do and
Yep.
certain resources to do them, but I think that's all correct, Lawrence.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so we'll if people have questions, just sort of raise your hand or do whatever to let us know that you have a question. And the folks out on Facebook too, you're included too. If you have questions or comments, please forward them so that we can share them with our guest and others.
And I have more stories if we need to fill in the gaps.
Oh no, we don't have to do fillers. I'm sure you have lots of information.
Okay,
when you're looking forward, the newspapers right now seem to be disappearing. In these small newspapers, even sometimes the big town newspapers are disappearing. What do you project will be the impact of the consolidation, as they used to call it? And this isn't a new phenomenon, by the way. I remember when I was a paper boy, there were 4 newspapers in San Francisco, and now there's kind of one, so this is not just a small town phenomena. What do you see as the impact of that?
Well, it's a very complicated issue, but let's just talk about South Dakota weekly newspapers. Let's narrow it to that universe. The survival and prosperity of those newspapers depends less on what's going on Facebook and the internet, and more as to what's going on in those communities. So if those communities have a modest retail district, shopping, and a school, and a car dealer and a post office and those kinds of things, that is a big boost. It's so as those main streets decline, that the newspapers will follow. So if they prosper, the newspapers will also prosper. So if you look across South Dakota, roughly 120 newspapers. Interestingly, that for for Dusty Johnson, he has more media outlets in his at-large district than any other member of Congress. Isn't that interesting? So, 120 newspapers, I don't know, 30 or 40 radio stations, 10 TV stations or whatever. But so the, people talk about shopping locally or helping their local stores. That helps more than just those stores. That is the future of that newspaper in that town. So if all those stores close up and the advertising then drops off in that paper will not do well. Also, subscriptions are a big part of what weekly newspapers are. I don't know the exact revenue mix, but if people take for granted their local weekly paper and just read their neighbors instead of paying the X dollars, they're not very expensive. That would hurt the newspaper as well. So if you're interested in a prosperous local paper, you can see the two paths. One, subscribe to it. Two, probably support the advertisers who are in that, and so they can continue. Now, as you get more toward the metro thing, when Sioux Falls kind of qualifies now as our metro area, it's a different story, and that's probably longer and even more complicated. But I'd say the weekly newspapers in South Dakota depend on their local retail and subscriber base, and they will prosper accordingly.
I think there was a clarification asked for when you said Dusty Johnson has more newspapers.
Right. So
Yeah.
right. So each member of Congress, of course, has media calling them, and there are more media outlets in his district, and he doesn't own any newspapers. But if you're in Berkeley, where I used to be, there's kind of one newspaper outlet for the whole congressional district. But in South Dakota, it's part of the charm of our state. I think that, when they come to your town, they're gonna talk to your newspaper.
Sure. I think that understanding what the congressional district is, we have one congressperson, and so that's a whole state. Lots of small towns have small newspapers. In a larger state, they may have like one town and maybe sometimes just part of that town, and there's maybe no newspaper that's just for that part of the town. They have a whole town newspaper, so maybe you split it in half or something. So that's how the numbers come out.
Right.
So
we see it, a city like Brooklyn, or a borough like Brooklyn. The Brooklyn Eagle was the kind of the center of that community, and that when that closed, Brooklyn, they say, kind of lost its heart, lost its center. And now it is certainly recovered now as part of New York City, but Brooklyn went through a real dark period there when the Brooklyn Eagle folded, and that city, which has a number of congressional districts in it, it's a big borough. And Lawrence, you alluded at the beginning about kind of news deserts where newspapers have folded in big cities and small, and it's a small tragedy for those communities, and they often don't recognize it until it's happened. The good news is there are a lot of I think people filling in that void, or the nature abhors a vacuum, and so I think others have been started, or good alternatives maybe in some of those news deserts.
But one of the things that I think is important here is the actual reporting of the news, or gathering of the news. And you mentioned earlier that one of the things that people are looking for is like what's happening in my town. And it seems to me that many of the newspapers, they actually don't want to report those kind of things, because I have, let's say various community organizations, they send in their version of a news release, and let's face it, grandma's probably not going to be the best news release writer, but she, her club is having something, she sends it in, and unless it's in one of those columns where, like it's, hey, what's happening, some volunteer writer, it doesn't get coverage. And when the thing happens, it doesn't get coverage. So I'm wondering, is that a spot that local newspapers are, is that a blind spot for them, or is there a reason why they
Yeah,
don't do that?
I understand the question, and let's again go individually by newspaper on that. If that newspaper is prosperous enough, they will probably print more pages, which would allow for more of that information. If times are tough and their retail district has shrunk, they will shrink the size of that newspaper and then start the painful process of excluding things that they might otherwise include. So I think it has to do a little bit with the health of that. Now, remember, these are privately owned institutions. They're part of the capitalist society. They're not owned by, newspapers are not owned by the government. They're not nonprofit agencies. Some of us pursued nonprofit as a matter, but
Unprofitable, but not nonprofit.
yeah, thank you. But they're going to be, each publisher and each editor are going to make different decisions as what would include in that, and they have the right to do that as an editor or publisher. And someone said, no, I'm not going to. The Quilting Club does not. I don't think it's news, and so. Our strategy again is really not even to make very good decisions about that. It's like, just throw everything in there. It's just like the kitchen sink. You put in everything you can. There was a consultant that I knew many years ago who's just quite a character, but he said a good philosophy of a newspaper would be make it very easy for people to put things in the newspaper. Make things very hard for people to keep out of the newspaper.
Yes.
So, and trust me, we get phone calls and things that they would like to keep out of the newspaper. So,
Well,
but I always thought that was a good theory, frankly. Just keep throwing it in there and let people decide what they want and what they choose to pass by.
Well, I brought up that question, John, because you mentioned that was one of the things that pointed to a successful newspaper, is people getting those kind of items. So it would seem like if that is something that is profitable to the newspaper, because the more people they have reading it, the better their advertising is going to be, you would think. Then you would think if there's a call for, if people say, hey, I want to kind of see something that reflects me. It's like if people have their identities sometimes connected to, oh, so-and-so was in the paper, there was something about you, whatever it is, it just seems like newspapers would want to cover that, as opposed to saying, well, we don't want to talk about your church having a cookie sale, but if you want to buy an ad, we'll put it in. So they have the space. It's just like, it seems like they feel like, well, that's an ad, it's not a story. But according to what you were saying before, that's something people want to see.
Well, it is sometimes a challenging line to do that. Some people might say, 20% off slacks at the local men's store that's news.
Yeah, right.
And so when we say no, that's, so you do have to draw a line typically and it's usually when someone wants to sell something is usually the point at which you draw that line. But I think I'm going to tell another thing, that the paper at Freeman, South Dakota, one of the best weekly newspapers in South Dakota, maybe among best of all of them, a paper I admire and have known for a long time. They have a philosophy that goes like this: if you can find it on the internet, we're not going to put it in the paper. So anything that ESPN covers, anything that national, news covers, Fox News, any of that kind of stuff, we want to tell stories that are not being told elsewhere. So they want only Freeman stories and things that have not, and when I say not on the internet, I'm not saying it's like a Facebook thing, because those they would overlap, of course.
Yeah.
But if it's an Associated Press story you can find on the NewYorkTimes.com or whatever, it's not going to end up in the Freeman Courier. So it forces them to be hyper local and cover things. And those stories, I think, or those people, you really should read that paper. It's a great paper. They have a feature, I think, each week or maybe once a month called 5 Minutes With, and they'll just take some kind of random person and just spend 5 minutes and ask them questions and let them tell a story. My uncle, a longtime journalist, boy, that's a whole nother session about my uncle. It should be a humor column. I think it's a Dave Barry kind of thing, but he said every person has a story. And so he would come to visit Madison from Michigan, and he'd tuck a pencil behind his ear, and he'd go out on this main street of Madison. He'd come back by noon with 3 stories.
Yep. It
It was just by finding something and discovering something about them. So Freeman does a great job there. There's a lot of great weekly newspapers in South Dakota. I'd encourage you to look at them.
Well, that was actually going to be one of my next questions, comments, is like, when we're training journalists, it's almost like we're training them to get the big stories, but the stories that's most meaningful to people are those stories like you're saying your uncle did, especially in a small town, where if you want to know things or just even become aware of some of your neighbors, that kind of story, I would think, would be quite interesting, or who caught how many fish, or where the fish are biting or something like that. Those are the kind of things that people talk about often. So it signals to me that they're kind of interested in that.
Well, there was a time after Woodward and Bernstein where all journalism students wanted to take down the next president. And so there was, I think, a little bit of a lull in the kind of the small time journalism that you're talking about, Lawrence. And, everyone wanted to write 1 story a year, but it was going to be a great one. And again, this consultant that I knew and loved used to say, if there's one piece of advice I can give you, increase your story count, the number of stories that you can get in there. So it is a strategy. And yes, some young journalists want to do the big story, and those are important too. Woodward and Bernstein changed America for the better, in my opinion. So we want the big stories too, but Rosalind, I don't know if Woodward and Bernstein are going to have something going on there or not.
Well, I tell you, the stories are here, whether people tell them or not. That's another story. But bring your stool and popcorn. We got it going on here. It's all kind of stories. No shortage of stories. Well, this is your last chance. We got a couple minutes. If you got a quick question with a quick answer, anybody? Anybody?
Well, I always have questions. There's no end to it.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, I will criticize the New York Times. There was this sort of not just them. There was this sort of national sort of fad in the last few years. People would say things like, don't repeat the blank, don't repeat the falsehood, don't repeat the racial slur that someone said. And the New York Times was running a bunch of stories, which were a couple of years ago, like blank famous important person said a racial something, now they're fired. And I was like, wait, hold on. No, you need to tell me what they said. I don't need every word. I mean, I get that this is tricky, but you can't just say he said something and now he's fired. For one thing, it's like slander. It's like saying, well, he said something that's just too awful even to repeat. And I don't know if they've sort of backtracked on that. I'm using the New York Times as an example. But I thought, no, we're not in some weird world where I need to go, look it up on Google to find out what the person said. That's where I was.
Rob, there's also a changing and remembering both language and newspapering are are living organisms and they're changing all the time. And so the words that we thought sometimes were offensive now have become mainstream, and the words that we used to think were mainstream have become offensive. And part of the permanence of newspapering is, you know, you might print something that is offensive later. But yeah, I know what you're saying, that dilemma, and you know, how far can you go with that? Again, as a matter of policy, you have, you know, you will have children reading our newspaper. We have comics and we have puzzles and such. So yeah, it's a trick. And also, I think, Rob, you and Lawrence have referred to kind of that, at least that an accusation. Remember, an accusation should not be a conviction. And there is some credence that once it's published, it must be, you know, so you have to be careful about, you know, printing things that are accusations and not yet complete. That is a hard one. You know, if there's an obvious crime in Madison and people want to know about that, we can go a little bit farther than if there's something going on surreptitiously in the mayor's office that we're just starting to get a handle on. That one, you kind of have to wait until it's much more mature before you can put that in. But if, you know, if there's a car wreck at the main street, you can put more stuff in there earlier.
Well, we're actually running out. We've run out of time. So I want to thank you. I know we don't have to do fillers here. There's always lots of interest, especially when we have
one more question though. Did you see, or this comment from Deb?
They're done.
Oh.
Well, they can pick it up in the chat. But
fair enough.
I hope people will join you at the Wash Pal on Monday. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Next week, same time, same station.
Best wishes.
Bye.
Bye-bye.